The 1937 flood that swallowed the Ohio Valley and tested America's strength in the Depression. It was the flood that swallowed the Ohio Valley and tested America's strength in the Depression, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 1. January 1937. The heart of winter, the heart of the Great Depression. Across the Ohio Valley, families woke to the sound of rain, not the gentle kind that lulls children to sleep, but something heavier, something relentless. In Louisville, Kentucky, a factory worker named Harold Mitchell stood at his kitchen window, watching the water pool in the yard. His wife, Dorothy, poured coffee and glanced at the gray sky. Their 2 children sat at the table eating oatmeal, unaware that within days their home would be underwater. Harold had seen floods before. Everyone in the valley had. The Ohio River was a companion and a threat, a source of life and a force of destruction. But this time something felt different. The rain had been falling for weeks. The ground was saturated. The river was rising faster than anyone could remember, and still the rain kept coming. In Cincinnati, a young nurse named Evelyn Carter finished her night shift at the city hospital. She walked home through streets slick with water, her shoes soaked through. The newspapers had been warning about the rising river levels, but warnings had become routine. People nodded and went about their lives. They had survived before. They would survive again. Evelyn climbed the stairs to her small apartment, hung her coat to dry, and fell into bed. She did not know that within 48 hours she would be working around the clock, tending to refugees in a city transformed into an island. The Ohio River begins in Pittsburgh, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers merge. It flows southwest for nearly 1,000 miles, passing through or bordering 6 states before emptying into the Mississippi at Cairo, Illinois. Along its banks in 1937 lived millions of Americans, factory workers and farmers, shopkeepers and schoolteachers, families who had built their lives around the river, trusting its rhythms, respecting its power. But that January, the river broke its promise. The rains that began in early January were unlike anything in living memory. Storm after storm swept across the region, dumping inches of water on already saturated ground. Tributaries swelled, creeks became torrents, and the Ohio River, fed by 1,000 smaller streams, began to rise. In Evansville, Indiana, a man named George Weaver ran a small grocery store 3 blocks from the riverfront. He had owned the store for 12 years, inheriting it from his father. The shelves were stocked with canned goods, flour, sugar, and the modest necessities of Depression-era life. George watched the river reports with growing unease. By January 18th, the water had reached flood stage. By January 20th, it was still rising. George made a decision. He moved his most valuable inventory to the 2nd floor of his building, a precaution that would save his livelihood, but not his home. His wife, Martha, packed essential belongings into suitcases. Their daughter, Emma, age 9, asked if they were going on a trip. Martha smiled and said yes, a little trip, just until the water goes down. She did not know they would not return for 3 months. The cities along the Ohio River were, in 1937, unprepared for what was coming. Flood walls existed in some places, but they were designed for ordinary floods, not for the catastrophe that was building. Weather forecasting was primitive by modern standards. There were no satellites, no computer models, no way to see the full scope of what was gathering in the clouds above the valley. People relied on experience and intuition, on the wisdom passed down from generation to generation. But experience had its limits. No one alive had seen a flood like this. In Portsmouth, Ohio, a schoolteacher named Margaret Lawson dismissed her students early on January 21st. The streets were filling with water, and parents were arriving to collect their children. Margaret watched the chaos from her classroom window. Automobiles sputtered through knee-deep water. Horses pulled wagons loaded with furniture. Families hurried along sidewalks carrying what they could. Margaret gathered her own things and walked home, the water rising with every step. By the time she reached her boarding house, the 1st floor was flooding. She climbed to the 2nd floor and watched the street become a river. The statistics of the 1937 flood are staggering, but statistics alone cannot capture what happened. In the end, nearly 400 people would lose their lives. More than 1 million would be driven from their homes. Property damage would exceed $500 million, an almost incomprehensible sum in Depression-era terms. Entire cities would be submerged. The flood would stretch from Pittsburgh to Cairo, affecting a region home to millions. But behind every statistic was a human story. A family separated, a home destroyed, a life changed forever. Harold Mitchell. Harold, the factory worker in Louisville, made his decision on January 22nd. The water was rising faster now, and the radio was broadcasting evacuation orders. Harold loaded his family into their old Ford and drove toward higher ground. The roads were clogged with traffic. Everyone was trying to leave at once. Dorothy held their youngest child in her lap, staring out the window at the water creeping across the streets. Their older child, Thomas, age 10, asked where they were going. Harold said they were going to stay with Uncle Robert up on the hill. It would be an adventure. Thomas nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. He had seen the river before, calm and steady. This was something else. This was a monster waking up. By January 24th, Louisville was in crisis. The Ohio River had risen to unprecedented levels, and the city's flood walls were failing. Water poured into the streets, into homes, into businesses. The power went out. The water supply became contaminated. Fires broke out in flooded neighborhoods, and firefighters struggled to respond, their trucks unable to navigate the submerged streets. The city that had thrived on the river was now drowning in it. Evelyn Carter, the nurse in Cincinnati, found herself at the center of the emergency. The hospital was overwhelmed with patients, many of them suffering from exposure, illness, and injuries sustained during evacuations. Evelyn worked 18-hour shifts, catching sleep in empty corridors, eating when she could. She saw families arrive with nothing but the clothes on their backs. She saw children separated from parents, elderly people confused and frightened, young men who had lost everything they had worked for. And she saw something else too. She saw people helping each other, strangers sharing food, neighbors carrying neighbors to safety. In the midst of catastrophe, she saw the best of humanity. The flood of 1937 was not a single event, but a slow-motion disaster that unfolded over weeks. The rain fell and fell. The river rose and rose, and the people of the Ohio Valley did what they had always done. They adapted. They endured. They survived. But survival came at a cost. Homes were destroyed. Livelihoods were wiped out. Communities that had stood for generations were scattered to the winds. And in the aftermath, nothing would be the same. George Weaver, the grocer in Evansville, returned to his store in late February. The water had finally receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris. His store was a ruin. The second floor had survived, but everything below was destroyed. The walls were coated with silt. The wooden floors had buckled and warped. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of mold and decay that would take months to clear. George stood in the doorway, looking at what remained of his father's legacy. Martha stood beside him, holding Emma's hand. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. But George Weaver did not give up. He could not give up. In the weeks that followed, he cleaned and rebuilt. Neighbors helped when they could. The community came together, sharing resources, sharing labor, sharing hope. By summer, the store was open again, smaller than before but still standing. George never forgot the flood. He kept a mark on the wall showing how high the water had risen. And he made sure his daughter Emma understood what it meant. It meant that life could change in an instant. It meant that everything you built could be swept away. But it also meant that you could rebuild. You could start again. You could survive. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because the stories we tell here are not just history. They are the stories of people like you and me, facing impossible odds and finding the strength to carry on. Subscribe now and join us on this journey through the moments that shaped who we are. Chapter 2. The rain began in earnest on January 6, 1937. Weather stations across the Ohio Valley recorded extraordinary precipitation. In some areas, more than 15 inches of rain fell in just 3 weeks. The ground, already saturated from earlier storms, could not absorb any more. Every drop that fell ran into streams, into creeks, into the tributaries that fed the Ohio River. And the river began to rise. In Pittsburgh, at the headwaters of the Ohio, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The Monongahela and Allegheny rivers, swollen by rain and snowmelt, poured into the Ohio with tremendous force. By January 17th, the Ohio River at Pittsburgh had risen to flood stage. By January 19th, it was 5 feet above flood stage and still climbing. The industrial districts along the riverfront were the first to flood. Factories shut down. Workers were sent home. Warehouses filled with water. James Novak was a steel worker in Pittsburgh, employed at one of the great mills that lined the Monongahela. He had worked at the mill for 15 years, through good times and bad. The depression had been hard. Hours had been cut. Pay had been reduced. But James had held on, supporting his wife and 3 children through sheer determination. When the flood came, James was told to go home and wait. The mill was shutting down. No one knew for how long. James walked home through streets already ankle-deep in water. His house was on higher ground, safe for now, but the news from the river was grim. The flood was expected to be the worst in decades. James gathered his family and prepared for the worst. They filled the bathtub with clean water. They moved valuables to the second floor. They stocked up on food and candles, and then they waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Hour after hour, day after day, the rain kept falling. The river kept rising. Radio broadcasts gave updates, but the news was always the same. The flood was getting worse. More evacuations were ordered. More neighborhoods were underwater. James Novak sat by the radio, listening, watching the water creep closer to his home. His wife, Anna, kept the children busy with games and stories. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. They were trapped between hope and despair, waiting for a catastrophe they could not control. Downstream from Pittsburgh, the flood wave moved with relentless force. City after city felt its impact. Wheeling, West Virginia, Marietta, Ohio, Parkersburg, Huntington. Each community faced the same grim reality. The river was rising faster than anyone had predicted. Flood walls and levees that had seemed adequate were overtopped. Streets that had never flooded were underwater. And still, the rain kept coming. In Huntington, West Virginia, a teacher named Robert Anderson organized an evacuation of his elementary school. The building was in a low-lying area, and the floodwaters were approaching fast. Robert gathered his students, some of them crying, and led them to higher ground. He carried the youngest children on his back, wading through water that reached his waist. Parents met them at the evacuation point, relief and terror written on their faces. Robert Anderson saved every child in his care that day. Years later, his former students would remember him as a hero. But Robert never saw it that way. He was just doing what had to be done. The human cost of the flood was devastating, but so was the economic toll. The Ohio Valley in 1937 was an industrial heartland. Steel mills, coal mines, factories, and refineries lined the river for hundreds of miles. When the flood came, it did not discriminate. It swamped factories and farms alike. It destroyed machinery and livestock. It wiped out inventories and harvests. For a region already struggling through the Great Depression, the flood was a catastrophic blow. In Cincinnati, the flood reached its peak on January 26th. The Ohio River crested at nearly 80 feet, more than 25 feet above flood stage. It was the highest level ever recorded. The city's waterfront, home to warehouses, factories, and rail yards, was completely submerged. The famous suspension bridge, a symbol of Cincinnati's pride, rose from a sea of brown water. Thousands of residents fled to higher ground. Those who stayed faced desperate conditions. There was no electricity, no clean water, no way to get food or medicine. The city was paralyzed. Evelyn Carter, the nurse, worked through the crisis without rest. The hospital where she worked became a refuge for flood victims, and Evelyn found herself caring for patients in hallways, in waiting rooms, anywhere space could be found. She saw families arrive with nothing. She saw elderly patients who had been carried for miles through floodwaters. She saw children, frightened and hungry, clinging to parents who had lost everything. And through it all, she kept working. There was no other choice. One patient stayed with Evelyn for the rest of her life. A young woman, barely 20, arrived at the hospital with her infant daughter. The woman was suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. She had been trapped in her home for 2 days before rescuers found her. Her husband had gone out to find help and never returned. Evelyn did everything she could, but the woman's condition was grave. On the 3rd night, she passed away. Evelyn held the infant daughter in her arms, looking down at the tiny face, and made a silent promise. She would do whatever it took to help this child, to give her a chance. The infant's name was Grace. Evelyn arranged for her care with a local family who had offered to take in orphaned children. She visited when she could, bringing small gifts and checking on Grace's progress. Years later, after the flood had become a distant memory, Evelyn received a letter. It was from Grace, now grown, thanking the nurse who had saved her life. Evelyn kept that letter until the day she died. The flood of 1937 tested the limits of human endurance, but it also revealed the depths of human compassion. In Louisville, volunteers worked around the clock to evacuate residents from flooded neighborhoods. Boats of every description, fishing boats and rowboats and hastily constructed rafts, navigated the submerged streets, rescuing families from rooftops and upper floors. The Coast Guard deployed cutters and personnel. The National Guard mobilized. civilians volunteered by the thousands, and in the midst of chaos, a community came together. Harold Mitchell, the factory worker who had evacuated with his family, returned to Louisville as a volunteer. He could not sit idle while his city drowned. Harold joined a rescue team, spending days in a small boat, searching flooded neighborhoods for survivors. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Submerged obstacles lurked beneath the murky water. Currents could overturn a boat in seconds, but Harold kept going. He thought of his own family safe on higher ground, and he thought of the families still trapped in the flood. He could not abandon them. One rescue stayed with Harold forever. On the third day, his team heard cries for help from a partially submerged house. They maneuvered the boat to a second-floor window and found an elderly couple, husband and wife, clinging to each other. The man was too weak to climb into the boat. His wife refused to leave without him. Harold and his teammates lifted the man carefully, gently, and placed him in the boat. The wife followed, tears streaming down her face. She held her husband's hand and whispered words of comfort. They had been married for 52 years. They would not be separated now. The flood reached its peak in different cities at different times, a wave of destruction moving down the valley. By early February, the worst was over. The rain finally stopped. The river began to recede, and the people of the Ohio Valley began to count the cost. What they found was heartbreaking. Homes destroyed by the thousands, businesses wiped out, farms buried under layers of silt. The landscape itself had been transformed. Familiar landmarks were gone. Streets were unrecognizable. The communities that had stood along the river for generations were changed forever. But the people endured. They cleaned and rebuilt. They mourned their losses and celebrated their survival. They told stories of courage and compassion, of neighbors helping neighbors, of strangers becoming friends. The flood of 1937 had tested them to the limit, but it had not broken them. Chapter 3. The Great Flood of 1937 did not happen in a vacuum. It came at a moment when America was already on its knees. The Great Depression had devastated the nation. Unemployment was rampant. Poverty was widespread. Families struggled to put food on the table, to keep roofs over their heads. And then came the flood, adding catastrophe to crisis. In the Ohio Valley, the Depression had hit hard. The industries that had once provided prosperity, steel and coal and manufacturing, were operating at a fraction of their capacity. Workers who had once earned good wages were now scraping by on relief payments, if they were lucky. Families doubled up in cramped apartments. Children went hungry. Hope was in short supply. The flood made everything worse. Factories that had been struggling to stay open were now underwater. Workers who had been barely employed were now homeless. Farms that had been hanging on were now buried under silt. The economic damage was incalculable. But the flood also revealed something important about America in the Depression. It showed that even in the darkest times, people could find the strength to help each other. It showed that communities could come together in ways that transcended politics and economics. And it showed that the government, which had been struggling to respond to the Depression, could mobilize resources on a massive scale when the need was great enough. President Franklin Roosevelt responded to the flood with characteristic energy. Federal agencies swung into action. The Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and other New Deal programs diverted resources to flood relief. The Red Cross launched one of the largest disaster relief operations in its history. Aid poured into the stricken region from across the country. And for a moment, the nation came together. In Louisville, the response was extraordinary. The city had been hit harder than any other, with nearly 70% of its area underwater at the flood's peak. But the people of Louisville did not wait for help. They helped themselves. Volunteers organized evacuation centers. Local businesses donated food and supplies. Churches opened their doors to refugees. Radio stations broadcast updates and pleas for assistance around the clock. Martha Collins was one of those volunteers. A school teacher by profession, Martha had been driven from her home by the rising water. She found shelter with relatives on higher ground and immediately began looking for ways to help. She ended up at a makeshift evacuation center in a church gymnasium where hundreds of flood victims had gathered. The scene was overwhelming. Families huddled on cots. Children cried. The smell of wet clothing and exhaustion filled the air. Martha got to work. She organized meals. She distributed blankets. She comforted frightened children and reassured anxious parents. She worked 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the corner of the gymnasium, eating when she remembered to. For 3 weeks, the church gymnasium was her home. and the flood victims who passed through became her family. One family in particular touched Martha's heart. A young mother with 3 small children arrived at the center, dazed and exhausted. Her husband had been working a night shift at a factory when the flood hit. He had not come home. The young mother did not know if he was alive or dead. Martha took the family under her wing. She found them a quiet corner, brought them food, sat with the children while the mother rested. Days passed. There was no word of the husband. Then, on the 5th day, a man appeared at the center. He was gaunt and dirty, his clothes torn, but his eyes were alive with desperate hope. He called out a name. The young mother heard it and screamed. She ran to him, the children following, and they embraced in the middle of the crowded gymnasium. Everyone stopped to watch. Some wept. Martha Collins wept too. In that moment, amid all the loss and suffering, there was joy, there was reunion, there was hope. If this story is touching your heart, leave a comment right now saying, "We are stronger together." Let me know if you believe, like these families did, that hope can survive even the darkest flood. The flood of 1937 left scars that would take years to heal, but it also left lessons that would shape America for generations. The inadequacy of existing flood control measures was painfully clear. The levees and flood walls that had been built over the decades were simply not enough. They had been designed for ordinary floods, not for catastrophes, and ordinary floods, it turned out, were not the only kind. In the aftermath, Congress took action. The Flood Control Act of 1938 authorized a massive expansion of flood control infrastructure across the country. Billions of dollars would be spent over the following decades on dams, levees, and reservoirs. The Ohio River Valley would be transformed, its floods tamed, its cities protected. The lessons of 1937 would not be forgotten, but the most important lessons were not about infrastructure. They were about humanity. The flood showed that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, could rise to meet the challenge. It showed that communities, bound together by shared suffering, could find strength they did not know they had. And it showed that even in the depths of the Depression, even when everything seemed lost, hope could survive. Harold Mitchell returned to Louisville in late February, when the waters had finally receded. His home was damaged but not destroyed. He and Dorothy spent weeks cleaning and repairing, salvaging what they could, replacing what they could not. Their children helped, learning lessons about resilience and determination that would stay with them for life. Thomas, the older boy, later said that the flood was the defining experience of his childhood. It taught him that nothing was permanent, that everything could be lost. But it also taught him that loss was not the end. You could always start again. George Weaver, the grocer in Evansville, faced a longer road. His store had been gutted by the flood, and he did not have the resources to rebuild on his own. But he was not alone. Neighbors and customers pitched in. Local churches organized donations. A small loan from a sympathetic banker provided the capital he needed to restock his shelves. By summer, George's store was open again. It was smaller than before, humbler, but it was his. Emma, George's daughter, remembered the flood for the rest of her life. She remembered the fear of leaving home, the uncertainty of the weeks in temporary shelter, the joy of returning, but most of all she remembered the community that had come together to help her family. She remembered neighbors she barely knew showing up to clean mud from the floors. She remembered strangers donating food and clothing. She remembered the sense that, even in disaster, people were good. People cared. The flood of 1937 was a catastrophe. There is no other word for it. Nearly 400 lives lost. More than 1 million people displaced. Hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. Cities paralyzed. Communities shattered. The Ohio Valley would never be quite the same. But the flood was also something more. It was a test of character, and the people of the Ohio Valley passed that test. They faced the worst that nature could throw at them, and they did not break. They bent, they struggled, they suffered, but they did not break. Chapter 4. By early February 1937, the waters began to recede. Slowly, painfully, the flood released its grip on the Ohio Valley. Streets that had been rivers became mud-choked lanes. Homes that had been submerged emerged as ruins. The landscape was transformed, coated in silt and debris, unrecognizable to those who had known it before. The return was almost as difficult as the evacuation. Families came back to find their homes destroyed, their possessions ruined, their lives upended. The smell of decay hung over everything. Mold crept across walls. Foundations had shifted, floors had buckled. What the water had touched, the water had claimed. In Louisville, the Mitchell family returned to their home on a cold February morning. Harold unlocked the front door and pushed it open, revealing a scene of devastation. Mud covered the floors. Furniture had been overturned and scattered. The family photographs that had hung on the walls were ruined, the faces of ancestors blurred and faded. Dorothy stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Thomas and his younger sister looked around in shock. This was their home, but it was not their home. Everything was different. Harold put his arm around Dorothy and said they would fix it. They would clean and repair and rebuild. It would take time, but they would do it. Together. Dorothy nodded, wiping her eyes, and stepped inside. The work began that day. It would continue for months. Across the valley, similar scenes played out thousands of times. Families returned to wreckage and began the slow process of reclaiming their lives. The work was backbreaking. Mud had to be shoveled out. Walls had to be scrubbed. Damaged belongings had to be sorted. The salvageable separated from the lost. Every day brought new challenges, new heartbreaks, new small victories. The community response was remarkable. Neighbors helped neighbors. Churches organized work crews. Local businesses donated supplies. The sense of shared purpose that had emerged during the crisis continued in the aftermath. People who had lost everything worked alongside those who had been spared, united by a common determination to rebuild. In Cincinnati, Evelyn Carter continued her work at the hospital. The flood victims needed ongoing care, and the hospital was still overwhelmed. Evelyn saw patients suffering from infections, from respiratory illnesses, from the psychological trauma of losing their homes. She did what she could, offering comfort and treatment, listening to stories of loss and survival. The work was exhausting, but Evelyn would not have been anywhere else. She had found her purpose. The federal response continued as well. Relief agencies distributed food, clothing, and building materials. The Works Progress Administration organized cleanup crews, putting unemployed workers to work, removing debris and repairing infrastructure. The Red Cross operated shelters for those who had nowhere else to go. Slowly, the region began to heal, but healing took time. Months passed before some families could return to their homes. Years passed before some businesses could reopen, and some things could never be restored. The lives lost could not be brought back. The memories of the flood, the terror and the loss would stay with survivors forever. Margaret Lawson, the schoolteacher in Portsmouth, returned to her classroom in March. The school had been damaged by the flood, but repairs had been made and the children needed to resume their education. Margaret stood before her students on that first day, looking at their faces, and felt a wave of emotion. These children had been through so much. They had seen their homes flood, their families displaced, their world turned upside down, and yet here they were, ready to learn, ready to move forward. Margaret made a decision that day. She would not pretend the flood had not happened. She would not try to return to normal as if nothing had changed. Instead, she would help her students process what they had experienced. She assigned them to write about the flood, to draw pictures, to share their stories. The classroom became a place of healing as well as learning, and the children, given the opportunity to express their feelings, began to recover. One student's story stayed with Margaret. A boy named William, quiet and serious, wrote about his family's evacuation. He described the rising water, the frantic packing, the long drive to his grandmother's house on higher ground. He described the weeks of waiting, the fear and uncertainty, the news of neighbors whose homes had been destroyed, and then he described the return, the moment when his family drove back to Portsmouth and saw their house still standing. It was damaged, William wrote, but it was still there. His father cried. His mother cried. William cried too, but they were happy tears. They were home. The flood of 1937 became part of the collective memory of the Ohio Valley. In every town and city along the river, people remembered. They remembered where they were when the water rose. They remembered who helped them and whom they helped. They remembered the losses and the survival. The flood became a reference point, a before and after. Everything was measured against it. In the years that followed, the region rebuilt. New homes rose where old ones had fallen. New businesses opened. New families moved in, drawn by opportunity and community. The scars of the flood faded, though they never entirely disappeared. High watermarks were painted on buildings, reminders of how high the water had reached. Photographs were preserved in local historical societies, showing streets transformed into rivers, homes half submerged, boats navigating what had once been downtown. And the stories were passed down. Parents told children, grandparents told grandchildren. The flood became part of the identity of the Ohio Valley, a shared heritage of suffering and survival. It was a reminder of what could happen, of the power of nature and the fragility of human constructions, but it was also a reminder of what people could endure, of the strength that emerges in crisis, of the bonds that form when everything else is stripped away. Harold Mitchell lived in Louisville for the rest of his life. He raised his children, worked at his factory, and grew old in the house he had rebuilt after the flood. When he passed away in 1978, his son Thomas found a box in the attic. Inside were photographs from the flood, newspaper clippings, a diary that Dorothy had kept during those terrible weeks. Thomas sat in the attic, reading his mother's words, and wept. He had been a child during the flood, but now he understood it as an adult. He understood the fear his parents had felt, the strength they had shown, the love that had held the family together. Thomas Mitchell kept the box and its contents. He showed them to his own children and grandchildren. The flood of 1937 became part of his family's story, a chapter that could never be forgotten. And when people asked Thomas what he remembered about the flood, he always said the same thing. He remembered the fear, yes, he remembered the destruction, but most of all, he remembered the kindness. He remembered strangers helping strangers, neighbors helping neighbors. He remembered that, even in the worst of times, people could be good. Chapter 5. The Great Flood of 1937 was more than a natural disaster. It was a turning point, a moment that changed how America thought about floods and how to prevent them. In the aftermath, as the mud dried and the rebuilding began, a national conversation emerged. How had this happened? How could it be prevented from happening again? What responsibility did the government have to protect its citizens from the fury of the rivers? The answers would reshape the American landscape. Before 1937, flood control was largely a local matter. Cities and towns along rivers built their own levees, their own flood walls, with little coordination and inconsistent standards. The federal government played a limited role, funding some projects, but leaving most decisions to state and local authorities. The result was a patchwork of protections, adequate for ordinary floods but woefully insufficient for catastrophes. The 1937 flood exposed these weaknesses with brutal clarity. Cities that had trusted their flood walls watched in horror as the water overtopped them. Communities that had never flooded before found themselves underwater. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed local resources and demanded a national response. That response came in the form of the Flood Control Act of 1938. Passed by Congress and signed by President Roosevelt, the act authorized a massive expansion of federal flood control efforts. Billions of dollars would be appropriated over the following decades for dams, levees, reservoirs, and other infrastructure. The Army Corps of Engineers, already involved in river management, would take the lead in designing and building these projects. Flood control would become a national priority. The transformation of the Ohio River Valley was dramatic. In the years and decades following the flood, the Corps of Engineers built a system of dams and reservoirs that fundamentally changed how the river behaved. These structures captured excess water during heavy rains and released it gradually, reducing the peaks of flood waves. Levees and flood walls were strengthened and extended, providing greater protection to cities and towns along the river. The wild, unpredictable Ohio was tamed, its floods brought under control. The results were impressive. In the decades since 1937, the Ohio Valley has experienced many periods of heavy rain, many potential floods, but none has approached the catastrophic scale of 1937. The infrastructure built in response to that disaster has protected millions of people and billions of dollars in property. The lessons of 1937 have been learned, at least in part, but the lessons went beyond infrastructure. The flood also changed how Americans thought about disaster response. The Red Cross, which had mounted a massive relief effort, emerged from the flood as a central player in American emergency management. Federal agencies developed new protocols for coordinating disaster response across multiple states. The model of government, private organizations, and volunteers working together became the template for future disasters, and the flood changed how people in the Ohio Valley thought about themselves. The shared experience of the catastrophe created bonds that lasted for generations. Communities that had been divided by class or ethnicity or politics came together in the face of the flood and emerged with a stronger sense of unity. The flood became a source of identity, a story that people told about who they were and what they had overcome. Robert Anderson, the Huntington schoolteacher who had carried children to safety, continued teaching for another 30 years. He never spoke much about the flood, deflecting praise with quiet modesty. But his students knew what he had done. They passed the story down to their own children and grandchildren. When Robert Anderson died in 1982, the local newspaper published an obituary that called him a hero. Robert would have been embarrassed, but he deserved the recognition. Evelyn Carter, the Cincinnati nurse, eventually adopted Grace, the infant whose mother had perished in the flood. It was not an easy path. There were bureaucratic obstacles, financial challenges, questions from well-meaning friends who wondered if a single working woman could raise a child. But Evelyn was determined. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. Grace grew up knowing her story. Evelyn told her about her mother, about the flood, about the terrible circumstances of her birth, and the love that had brought her through. Grace carried that knowledge with her always. She became a nurse herself, following in Evelyn's footsteps, dedicating her life to caring for others. When Evelyn passed away in 1971, Grace was at her bedside, holding her hand, whispering words of gratitude and love. The flood of 1937 receded into history, but its echoes continued to ripple through time. In the Ohio Valley, high water marks still stand on buildings, faded but visible. Museums display photographs and artifacts from the disaster. Every January, some newspapers still run retrospectives, reminding readers of what happened and what was learned. And the stories survive. Families still tell tales of evacuation and return, of loss and recovery, of kindness and courage. The flood is part of the DNA of the Ohio Valley, woven into the identity of the region. It is a reminder of vulnerability and a testament to resilience. It is history that still lives. The flood control infrastructure built in response to 1937 has its critics. Environmentalists point out that dams and levees disrupt natural ecosystems, altering the flow of sediment and affecting wildlife. Some argue that the sense of security provided by flood control has encouraged development in floodplains, actually increasing the potential damage from future floods. These are valid concerns, and the debate over how best to manage rivers continues. But for the people of the Ohio Valley, the flood of 1937 remains a defining moment. It was the worst flood in recorded history, a catastrophe that tested the region to its limits, and it was the event that forced America to take flood control seriously, to invest in infrastructure that has protected millions of lives. The flood was a tragedy, but it was also a catalyst for change. Chapter 6. The story of the 1937 flood does not have a neat ending. History rarely does. The waters receded, the region rebuilt, life went on. But the flood left marks that time could not erase. Scars on the landscape, memories in the hearts of survivors, lessons that shaped a nation. Consider the scope of what happened. In January 1937, unprecedented rains fell across the Ohio Valley. The Ohio River and its tributaries swelled beyond anything in living memory. From Pittsburgh to Cairo, 1,000 miles of river transformed into a weapon of destruction. Cities drowned, farms vanished. Nearly 400 people lost their lives. More than 1 million were driven from their homes. The damage in Depression-era dollars exceeded $500 million. But consider also what emerged from the disaster. A nation mobilized to help. Federal agencies, private organizations, and ordinary citizens worked together in one of the largest relief efforts in American history. Communities that had been struggling through the Depression found new strength in shared adversity, and in the aftermath, America invested in flood control infrastructure that would protect the Ohio Valley for generations. The flood of 1937 was a test. It tested the levees and flood walls that people had trusted. It tested the forecasting systems that were supposed to provide warning. It tested the emergency response capabilities of local, state, and federal governments. Many of these systems failed the test, but the people did not fail. When the waters rose, they rose to meet the challenge. Martha Collins, the volunteer who had worked in the Louisville Evacuation Center, returned to teaching when the crisis passed, but she never forgot what she had seen. She never forgot the families who had lost everything, the children who had been frightened and confused, the moments of reunion that had brought tears to her eyes. She spent the rest of her career teaching children about community, about responsibility, about the importance of helping those in need. She retired in 1962, honored by her colleagues and beloved by generations of students. When she died in 1979, her obituary mentioned her work during the flood. It was, the newspaper said, her finest hour. George Weaver, the Evansville grocer, rebuilt his store and ran it until his retirement in 1955. His daughter Emma took over the business, running it for another 20 years before selling it to a larger chain. The store that George's father had founded, that George had saved from the flood, became part of a corporate enterprise. But the legacy survived. Emma's children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the flood, about their great-grandfather's determination, about the community that had come together to help. The flood was part of their family history, a source of pride and a reminder of resilience. The flood of 1937 changed America. It led to the Flood Control Act of 1938 and the massive investment in flood control infrastructure that followed. It established patterns of disaster response that would be refined and expanded in the decades to come. It showed what government could accomplish when it mobilized resources on a national scale. And it reminded Americans that they were part of something larger than themselves, that when disaster struck, they would face it together. But perhaps the most important legacy of the flood was the human one. The stories of survival and sacrifice, of courage and compassion, became part of the fabric of the Ohio Valley. They were passed down through families, told in schools, preserved in local histories. They reminded people of what their parents and grandparents had endured, of the strength that ordinary people could find in extraordinary circumstances. The 1937 flood was not the last flood to strike the Ohio Valley. In 1997, another major flood caused extensive damage, though nothing approaching the scale of 1937. Climate change raises the specter of more frequent and more severe weather events, of floods that could once again overwhelm the infrastructure built to contain them. The lessons of 1937 remain relevant. The rivers that give life can also take it away. Preparation and vigilance are essential, and when the waters rise, communities must come together. The Ohio River still flows through the heart of America, from Pittsburgh to Cairo, past cities and farms and factories. It is calmer now, its floods controlled by dams and levees, its behavior monitored by sophisticated technology. But the river remembers, and so do the people who live along its banks. In Louisville, a museum exhibit tells the story of the 1937 flood. Photographs show streets submerged, buildings half underwater, boats navigating downtown. Artifacts include a child's toy recovered from the mud, a diary kept by a flood survivor, a tattered American flag that flew over an evacuation center. Visitors walk through the exhibit in silence, contemplating the images, reading the stories. Some are descendants of flood survivors, connecting with their family history. Others are newcomers to the region, learning about the event that shaped the community they have joined. All leave with a deeper understanding of what the flood meant and what it taught. The flood of 1937 was a tragedy. Nearly 400 lives lost. Countless more changed forever. Cities devastated. Communities scattered. The damage was incalculable. The suffering immense. But tragedy is not the whole story. The flood was also a testament to human resilience, to the capacity of ordinary people to face extraordinary challenges and emerge stronger. It was a moment when America came together, when communities united, when neighbors helped neighbors. It was, in the end, a story of hope. Harold Mitchell's grandson, David, visited Louisville in 2017, 80 years after the flood. He walked the streets his great-grandparents had walked, now dry and prosperous. He visited the site of the family home, long since replaced by newer construction. He stood by the river, watching it flow past, peaceful and contained, and he thought about what his family had endured, what they had overcome, what they had passed down. David Mitchell carried with him the box his grandfather Thomas had kept, the photographs and clippings and diary from 1937. He had read his great-grandmother Dorothy's words many times, her account of the evacuation and the waiting and the return. He knew the story by heart, but standing by the river, he felt it in a new way. He felt the fear and the hope, the loss and the recovery. He felt connected to history, to family, to the long chain of human experience that had led to this moment. The flood of 1937 is history now. The waters have long since receded. The survivors have passed away, leaving behind only stories and photographs. But the lessons endure. The lessons about preparation and response, about infrastructure and investment, about the power of nature and the fragility of human constructions. And the deeper lessons too. The lessons about community and compassion, about courage and resilience, about the strength that emerges when people come together in crisis. The Ohio Valley endured the flood of 1937. It endured because of levees and sandbags, yes, but more importantly, it endured because of people. People who risked their lives to save strangers, people who opened their homes to refugees, people who worked around the clock day after day to care for the sick and comfort the frightened, people who returned to devastated homes and began the long work of rebuilding, people who refused to give up, who found hope in the darkest moments, who proved that the human spirit is stronger than any flood. This is the story of the flood that swallowed the Ohio Valley and tested America's strength in the Depression. It is a story of tragedy and triumph, of loss and recovery, of despair and hope. It is a story that belongs to the past, but speaks to the present. It is a story worth remembering. If you watched this far, it means this story touched something in you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. Your comment means more than you know. It tells me that these stories matter, that the time spent researching and writing and producing is worthwhile, and it connects us, viewer and storyteller, in a shared appreciation for history and humanity. If you have not already, please subscribe to this channel. There are more stories to tell, more moments from history that deserve to be remembered. By subscribing, you ensure that you will not miss any of them. You become part of a community dedicated to understanding the past and learning from it. And if this video moved you, please give it a like and share it with others. Share it with friends and family. Share it on social media. Help spread these stories to people who might never have heard them otherwise. Every like, every share, every comment helps this channel grow and reach more people. Together we can keep these stories alive. The flood of 1937 tested America, and America passed the test. Not because the levees held, because often they did not. Not because the warnings came in time, because often they did not. America passed the test because its people refused to surrender. They faced the rising waters with courage. They helped each other with compassion. They rebuilt with determination. And they remembered, passing the stories down through generations, ensuring that the lessons of the flood would never be forgotten. The waters receded. The sun came out. Life went on. But the memory remained. And as long as there are people to tell the story, to listen to the story, to learn from the story, the flood of 1937 will never truly be over. It will live on, a reminder of what was lost and what was saved, of what nature can destroy and what humanity can endure. The Ohio River flows on, past Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, past Louisville and Evansville, past all the cities and towns and farms that line its banks. It flows on, carrying with it the memory of every flood, every drought, every moment of destruction and renewal. It flows on as it has for millennia, as it will for millennia more. And along its banks the people remember. They remember the flood that swallowed the valley. They remember the strength that brought them through, and they look to the future, prepared for whatever may come, knowing that they have faced the worst and survived. This is the story of the 1937 flood. This is the story of America in crisis. This is the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This is the story of hope. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering, and thank you for being part of this journey through history.